Hi folks, I'm Derek Olson, a biblical scholar with a love for the liturgy. Welcome to a Liturgical Look Forward for the week of Proper 9 in Year 2 of the Daily Office Lectionary. So every week we look at the scripture readings that are appointed for morning and evening prayer from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, which are also the same readings that are found in the popular Forward Day by Day devotional from Forward Movement. Let's go ahead and move into our first reading for this coming week. All right, so this week we're finally going to finish up the Book of Numbers, which we've been in for a couple of weeks now, and don't blank, we're also going to both begin and end the entire book of Deuteronomy while we're at it. All right, Numbers. So we're going to be finishing up this end section now, a new generation, and we're just going to be dipping into a couple of spots in that final part of it. And then we will be moving into Deuteronomy. As I said, we're going to sort of go through all of this in just a couple of days. So we're only going to get the briefest of glosses. Essentially, we're still kind of maintaining the thread of the history. So as a result, we're going to skip all of Deuteronomy's legal materials. We're going to get a little bit more of Deuteronomy in year 1. I think the loss of Deuteronomy is kind of problematic. So let me say a bit more about Deuteronomy in general and tell you why. All right, so the name Deuteronomy is from the Greek second law, meaning that it's sort of a second giving of the law, because it recaps a whole bunch of stuff. It begins and ends with a narrative frame, starting with Moses sort of recapping the wandering in the wilderness in chapters 1 to 4. Then we've got a section from 5 to 11 that sort of redoes the Ten Commandments and also gives a short version of the Sinai Covenant. Then there's a full-on legal section from 12 to 26 that recaps some of the hardest slogging parts from Leviticus. Then we've got a set of divine threats and promises that are connected with either keeping or disobeying the law in chapters 27 to 30 that kind of make modern people feel uncomfortable. Then in 31 to 34, that's the final narrative frame, where we're getting ready to move into the Promised Land and where we end up with the death of Moses at the very end of the book. So, both the treatment here and the canonical placement of Deuteronomy make it look like kind of an extra tack on that just repeats everything that's already been said in the previous 4 books of the Bible. Canonically speaking, therefore, Deuteronomy is to the law as Mark is to Matthew. It's the cut-down short form. However, it may in fact be the exact opposite, and the parallel may be more fitting than we think. So modern scholarship recognizes now that the Gospel of Mark was actually written before Matthew. Matthew is the expansion. Mark isn't the cut down. In the same way, it looks like Deuteronomy may actually be older in its written form, not exactly the final form we have it, but at least in its major written form, is older than other parts of the law. So Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers likely achieved their final written form after Deuteronomy did. Right? You see that whole Book of the Law section in there from chapters 12 to 26? Well, a lot of scholars believe that this was the codified form of the Book of the Law that was discovered in the temple in the reign of Josiah. So Josiah was king in the generation just before the exile. This is the time when the prophet Jeremiah was cutting his teeth, and this guy Shaphan shows up a lot in the book of Jeremiah as well as here. Josiah basically commanded a complete remodel of the temple and a thorough cleaning as well as an allotment or assessment of all of its cash. And as part of this book of the law was quote-unquote found there that directed Josiah's whole religious policy. So both the policies of Josiah and the fundamental stance of Jeremiah look so much like Deuteronomy 12 to 26 that it's hard not to see some major part of it as this book of the law. So we believe that other books of the law were collected and achieved written form during or perhaps just after the Babylonian exile. This is the collection that was actually written down before it, and therefore is actually prior to the other books. The other reason why Deuteronomy is so important is because this section from 5 to 11 repudiates so much of the myth of Jewish legalism. It reminds us of the big picture of the law itself, faith and obedience towards God. This section of Deuteronomy sounds so much like Jesus to me. Jesus and Jeremiah are both coming out of this section of Deuteronomy, and the fact that we're skipping it in year 2 and only kind of jumping through the high points at sketchy parts of year 1 are kind of a shame, I think. All right, well, enough of me whining about Deuteronomy. Here's what we're going to be reading this week. So we'll start out with God appointing Joshua as the successor of Moses. Then we're going to jump to the tribes of Gad and Reuben planning to stay in the Transjordan after promising to help take over the rest of the Promised Land. Then we get the 48 towns given to the Levites, including the 6 cities of refuge. The idea here is that if a person kills someone by accident, they can voluntarily go into exile into one of these 6 cities, and that the person's family then can't kill them for revenge. So these aren't like cities where the laws don't apply. They're alternatively both safe havens and voluntary exile spots for people who know that they've done something wrong. In Deuteronomy, in the second part of the week, we're continuing the narrative of the history, again, which is why we're skipping so much of everything. Moses gives a quick recap of the journey from Sinai and God's appointment of leaders. Then the authority for the invasion of the Promised Land is given to Joshua, again. Then Moses is shown writing down the law and commanding it to be read publicly every 7 years. And then finally on Saturday we kill off Moses and our quick dip into Deuteronomy. So let's go ahead and move then into our second readings for the week. So once again, we are continuing on through Romans. So this week we finished the last little bit of the righteousness and justification arc, and we're going to move into a new argument that's going to carry us from chapters 9 through 11. This week we're only going to see parts of that. So the problem that Paul is working out here concerns Israel and its salvation, especially given that even at that point, Paul and the early church can see that the people of Israel are not wholeheartedly embracing the Jesus movement. So the question is this: is God casting aside and nullifying his promises to Israel? And if he is, what does that mean about whether God can be trusted to keep divine promises? So, if we make a covenant with God, like Israel did, how do we know that God isn't going to change the terms on us? So, Paul has to walk a careful line here, just as he did with the law. He's got to say that God's promises to Israel stand, and that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises. So that's what he's going to be working out over the next 3 chapters, and that's the section we're going to pick up on Wednesday. All right, that's enough on the second readings. Let's go ahead and move on to our third readings. The third readings, we are going to be continuing through Matthew still, with no gaps. We've got 2 very long chapters right now. Chapter 23 is a series of extended woes that are directed against the scribes and the Pharisees. As I've said before and will say again, Jesus argues a lot with these people precisely because Jesus and the early church shared many commonalities with them. Many of the early Jewish Christians were likely Pharisees. Remember, their big thing was understanding the land of Israel as the spiritual temple. If you live in Israel, then you need to live as if you were living in the temple itself. That was kind of the Pharisees' line, and that's where they had serious disagreements with other folks like the Sadducees. Paul, the former Pharisee, remember, in 1 Corinthians, goes into a long discussion about the Christian community as the spiritual temple. If you are a Christian, then you need to live as if you yourselves embody the temple. So, similar kind of logic going on here. Bottom line, whenever we hear Jesus railing against the scribes and the Pharisees, we should sort of search and replace and insert in good religious folks, and then think, well, that's us. He's yelling at us. So this is our chance to check our church privilege, to make sure that we're not doing these very things that Jesus is rightly condemning. Then moving into chapter 24, this is Matthew's little apocalypse. Basically, we're going to move from Jerusalem and its destruction to the end of the age, and then the coming of the Son of Man, and the need for watchfulness. So, we begin with a warning against scribes and Pharisees and religious hypocrisy. We end with a call for watchfulness and discernment, which actually I think go together pretty darn well. That's what we've got for this week. If you'd like to pray the daily office online, I encourage you to check out the St. Bede's Breviary at breviary.stbedeproductions.com or stop by prayer.forwardmovement.org, where you can find the office and also the readings and reflections from Forward Day by Day. I want to give a big thank you to my Patreon supporters. Come on over there and join us, help support this, help keep this going as a thing. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, speaking of keeping this a thing, give me a thumbs up and let me know what you think of the show in the comments.